Thank you very much to Anna Fox and Maria Kapayeva and Sandra Krisic-Raban and Anna Kjuric. I'm not sure I've got these right. And the Fast Forward team for inviting me to be part of this conference. I'm really happy to be here. There's so many intriguing presentations. Today I want to look back at some of my works connected with war. And this will inevitably be a sketchy introduction. In the 1980s and 1990s, I worked as a photojournalist, and I was a member of the women's photography agency Format. I photographed numerous protests against the Thatcher regime in the 1980s, including peace protests at the Greenham Common Air Base, where American cruise missiles were sighted. I also worked on projects independently, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, I started to focus on parts of Eastern Europe, and particularly Kosovo. During the 1990s in Kosovo, as many of you here will know, the Kosovar Albanians lived under the repressive regime of Slobodan Milosevic in what was effectively a police state. Like other foreign and local photojournalists, I worked with restrictive permits, police roadblocks and surveillance. It was almost impossible to witness the police raids, such as what happened here in the countryside, and to photograph the evidence of human rights abuses, because police would cordon off the villages for several weeks, and photographers just couldn't get there. But once, in a remote Kosovo village up in the hills, I did come across this man called Nike. You see here, recovering in bed with bandages around his swollen feet, having been brutally beaten by police the day before. The room was filled with villagers who had come to offer moral support. They called it an attempt at slow-motion ethnic cleansing, and I wrote about this and other human rights issues in Kosovo several times for the Guardian newspaper. Oops, sorry. Yeah, there we go. But coming across a scene such as this was very rare indeed, and often there was no evidence of what had taken place. There was nothing to see. And also, often the man who'd been beaten up had gone into hiding. Then at the same time, on a more personal note, in my mid-30s, I had back problems. But the months of lying flat on my back at home gave me time to think about the shortcomings of photojournalism in trying to represent the hidden violence in Kosovo. And I also had to change my way of working and work more slowly, not as a photojournalist anymore. I returned to Kosovo and I started to work in a different way and began photographing the domestic interiors and gardens of the homes I visited, recording the stories of the inhabitants while sitting in sunny living rooms such as this, where I was given hospitality, or here, where the male inhabitant had actually stayed on in his house and described to me the violent abuse experienced in his home at the hands of state police and at the police station. So I started to work with the lack of visual evidence of state brutality. And here, the woman inhabitant poured out her story, and the trauma and fear she had experienced found expression in the rhythm and cadences of her speech. It was hard to credit what had happened in these spaces and in these tranquil autumn gardens. This small orchard and the stack of plastic chairs moved me in particular. I'd seen white chairs exactly like that in my parents' village in southern England that summer. And now, since then, those chairs are ubiquitous. They're all over the world. And next to this image in the book was the anonymous testimony of the homeowner describing being taken to the local police station and tortured. In the gallery spaces, excerpts from the interviews with the inhabitants were played from the loudspeakers and also available as transcripts, and extracts were reproduced as text in the small catalogue. The exhibition was another way of drawing attention to the situation, and in the gallery space we had reports by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International at a reading table for those wanting to know more. And the soundtrack's available on my website if anyone's interested, and this is just to show you the little book with the texts opposite, if anyone wants to have a look afterwards. Then in spring 1999, there we are, sorry, yeah, it just shows you the people I worked with, because every exhibition, every book is a collaborative effort, and where it went to. In spring 1999, once the Kosovo conflict escalated into war, hundreds of thousands of Kosovar Albanians were either expelled from their homes or fled in fear of attack by Serbian paramilitaries and Yugoslav army forces. 300,000 fled to Macedonia, and I travelled to Macedonia from London with a London-based Kosovar friend, and we wanted to try and help her traumatised parents who are now refugees. And this image here is typical of the news images at the time. And for me, as a photographer, I also wanted to document what was happening. And I felt that these generic photographs are necessary to portray the immediate trauma of the refugee experience. But I'd just been with my Kosovar friends who'd experienced the loss of their home, they'd fled across the border, they'd become refugees, and the process of taking this kind of picture felt too distanced, too detached for me. So on the spot there, in the refugee camp, I had to find a different way of working, and I decided to make kind of studio-style portraits of individuals in the camps, working slowly, often with a tripod, and then often following lengthy interviews that I'd carried out inside the tents. Some of the portraits, like this one, were made just 2 to 3 days after Lutfia and Luada had arrived in the camp after strenuous, frightening journeys over the border from Kosovo. This is Lutfia with her niece, Luada, and they're both wearing smart velvet clothing, handmade by the aunt, and the child wears lipstick. There's a spirit of defiance and of resistance. Can you actually see the text? I don't know if it's... Did I get it big enough? Yeah, just about. Each refugee had individual ways of surviving, emotionally, practically, and psychologically. And 21-year-old Edita kept with her small mementos, such as the last cigarette smoked by her grandmother, to try and calm her acute anxiety at a time when she thought her parents were dead back in Kosovo. Happy to say I'm still in touch with Edita, and her parents survived as well. Many of the refugees, can you give me the next slide please, when you get a second, presented themselves with poise and dignity. Ramadan habitually wore a suit, typical of farmers of the region, and the traditional Albanian hat, the police, which the police in Kosovo had so often pressured him to remove. Thank you. I had had several meetings with each individual interviewee in the Naproštino camp, and several months later I interviewed some of the refugees again after they returned home to Kosovo following the NATO bombing campaign and the KFOR entry into Kosovo on 12th June 1999. I had photographed Miradia before the war and whilst in a refugee camp. I then photographed her again after she had returned home to find her house in Pristina, which had been lent to an illegal school, burnt out after a battle. I also photographed Serbian enclaves where the inhabitants lived in isolation under KFOR UN protection, too frightened to leave the enclaves for fear of revenge attacks. A Bosniak interviewee also did not feel secure enough to be photographed, and we agreed I would photograph his coffee cup and smouldering cigarette on the cafe table instead. MB talked about the particular difficulties of being neither Albanian nor Serb, but a Bosniak, a Muslim Slav speaking the Bosnian language. Part of the point of my book, No Place Like Home, Echoes from Kosovo, was the long-term connection with those photographed or interviewed, and to see how their feelings and perspectives on the war and on the hatred between different ethnic groups changed as time went on. So there are lots of interviews in the book, and in fact the largest readership of the book was in Kosovo itself. I was intensely involved working in Kosovo as much as I could from 1989 to 2001, But then, for personal reasons, I needed to move on. And I also wanted to focus on what was going on in my own country. So I'm going to jump a few years here, but I'm staying on this particular slide for the moment because although in 2008 my most compelling reason to focus on air shows in the UK and initially arms fairs was as a critical background to the wars in which the UK government was involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were also other inspirations for this project. And I'm just going to mention one of those here, which I think was the most significant. And this was the experience of Luada, the 4-year-old girl here, I'd photographed with her aunt in the refugee camp. A few weeks after this photograph was taken, Luada was airlifted from Macedonia to the UK with her parents, and they started to settle into their new life in the town of Southport in northern England. When I went up to Southport to see them, her mother, Shipe, told me that Luada had been traumatised that summer by her first experience of the Red Arrows flying over Southport. The Red Arrows are the British Royal Air Force acrobatic team who perform at air shows. But the jets they fly are Hawk T-1 military fighter jets, but they're called the Red Arrows. So her mother, Shipe, said Luada was terrified. She pointed up at the planes and was screaming. The raucous display evoked her recent memories of airstrikes during the Kosovo War. So, of course, the experience of an air show can differ radically. It may be merely entertainment for one person, but can evoke terrifying memories for another. And this stayed with me. 12 years later, I returned to Southport and photographed the air show on the beach. With this new work, I was focusing on militarised everyday culture in the UK and the uneasy relationship between the military, marketing and entertainment. I was also looking at the continuing British preoccupation with World War II. Here above the beach is the Lancaster bomber, which was instrumental in the massively destructive and controversial area bombing of Hamburg and Dresden, the Royal Air Force night offensive over Germany. The Lancaster bomber is often feted as part of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight at air shows, which includes the Hurricane and the Spitfire, and actually particularly commemorates the undoubted bravery of the Spitfire pilots. And at these air shows, there sometimes seems to be a thin line between the commemoration of war and its celebration. These performances by World War II bombers may often be followed by shock and awe displays by fighter jets such as the Hawker Hunter, or more contemporary fighter jets such as the Tornado or the Eurofighter Typhoon. So these displays seemed an effort to gather support for our current day wars, British current day wars, to make contemporary war more acceptable. I was fascinated by this scene on Southport Beach, and that the security officers had left their chairs after the display by the Tornado fighter was over at the very end of the air show. And the beach itself looks very much like a desert. I could say much more about that, but I'm moving on to the next. Air shows are advertised as a fun day out for the family, and I also found humour here, though it's a very serious subject, which for me, what Chantal was saying earlier resonated with me. Looking at the perpetual fascination with war and fascination with the imaginary experience of war. So here is a chance collision of different kinds of fantasy, nostalgia, performance and time zones. The spectacular display by the Red Arrows disrupts the performance by the living history reenactors here. Oh no, help. Sorry. Wow, my finger was too close to that. Let me try it again. There we go, here. So this nurse here was actually dressing somebody's wounds at the time, pretending to be, you know, a Second World War kind of, nurse tent, first aid tent, whatever. And then the Red Arrows came into the frame, and the nurse rushes to the fence to take pictures of these contemporary fighter jets. And meanwhile, the young boys in their camouflage jackets are in their own war fantasy. instinctively pointing their toy guns up at the fighter jets, and their mother at the edge of the frame, her feelings unknown. And here we have another set of fantasies, the adults' fantasy, with another living history group, recreating life back in the 1940s with the WRVS van, that's the Women's Royal Voluntary Service canteen van, and the vintage ice cream van. And then there's this moment of the boy's fantasy, living in his own world, imagining himself perhaps in a rescue scenario or a war scenario. And although this work looks at the endless creep of militarism into everyday life, it's complex because much of the English coastline is beautiful. And so the images have this contradictory feel and may be experienced as both aesthetic and disturbing. Here over the tannoys, the very British, the very patriotic Red Arrows, said the announcer over the loudspeakers at Clacton-on-Sea on the east coast of England. There were also images of arms fairs in the home front exhibition, which were looking at the more overt marketing of war. Just a glimpse of one image here of the MBDA missile stand at the Paris Air Show. And this again is the collaboration here. Worked very closely with Pippa Oldfield, who is here today and will be speaking tomorrow, and is the author of Photography and War. And that was all a very wonderful experience working together. Finally, to move to my newest project, not that new, 3 years ago, but still, the plane. My mother used to live in Wiltshire, which is a very militarised county in the south of England. The military are embedded there, and their presence is normalised. You cannot escape the sense of the countryside as not just a peaceful retreat from the city, but also a place of violence. Parts of Wiltshire are peppered with military bases forbidden to photograph, the sounds of the hunt or the shooting of pheasants. Salisbury Plain, the UK's largest training area, was half an hour from my mother's doorstep. The plain is a contradictory space. It's a military area, which is also a conservation area and full of archaeological sites. As in the home front, the landscape is disrupted by a military presence, but it's a more permanent presence, an occupancy. There are odd signs in the landscape. So what we saw there was a sign for the soldiers not to disrupt this space as it's an ancient archaeological site. And I was trying to respond to the complexities of this space, the coexistence of the tranquil or the pastoral and traces of military training, such as the red box for connecting field telephones in this copse in the distance, or in the foreground, the tracks made by military vehicles in the turf. And here, the more obvious signs of damage, the tank tracks, and in the foreground, wildflowers, a sense of the ecology of the place. I also photographed the structures used for military training, and some of these places feel very eerie and sinister. I took solace from that beautiful beech tree there. But I think throughout the book, there's a sense of the landscape holding sway over human activity. Here, a forward operating base constructed in the middle of our involvement in Afghanistan. It's constructed in 2005 to resemble an Afghan compound in a remote part of the plain. So I've been told I've only got, I think, half a minute left, so I'm just going to go through the rest of the pictures. I started to use very distanced views, partly because of the prohibitions of not being allowed into the impact area, partly because I don't work with telephoto lenses, and partly because I wanted then to create more distanced views. And I enjoyed sort of thinking about what those might mean, having tiny figures in the landscape, which for me suggests a kind of timelessness and perpetuity of war. And I was hoping that the plain might once be free of the sights and sounds of imaginary battle, in the way that Greenham Common, the airbase I mentioned that I'd photographed at, is now common land. although sadly there's now talk about the sighting of American cruise missiles yet again in England. I'm going to finish now, I only have a little bit left, but just as the book is Pippo co-editor, and that's it, thank you.